It says that we're live in the meeting now, sir. So we'll begin, if with your permission. Great. Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to all of you who've joining us from all the parts of the world. My name is Chandni Jaswal. I'm a core team member here at Karwa, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. And today we are joined by Professor Salil Misra, which is and he will be giving the third of the lecture series, third of his lectures at the Karma Heritage Special Lecture Series that we have here. A quick introduction to our prolific author and speaker for today. Professor Salil Mishra has been a professor of history at the Ambedkar University in Delhi. Additionally, Professor Misra is an expert on the communal politics in northern India in the 1940s and the partition movement, which is also the topic of our lecture today. Professor Misra has also written a prolific number of books, including his monograph called A Narrative of Communal Politics, Uttar Pradesh 1937 to 39, and has also been the visiting researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development Center for History of Emotion in Berlin. He's also served he's also served as a part of the IGNU, which is the Indira Gandhi National Open University. The topic of Professor Misra's lecture today here at Karwa Heritage is making sense of the partition in the 21st century. So without further ado, sir, I hand it over to you. Thank you very much once again for agreeing to be a part of a three-part lecture series for our audience here. Over to you.
Uh, Thank you very much, Chandni. Thank you, Ishan. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity provided by Karma, not just that I was able to reach out to students and other listeners, but I was also able to rethink some of these issues and prepare myself for them and think afresh on some of these important issues on which so much has been written. This was a series of three lectures, of which today is the last lecture on how do we look at the idea of partition in general and Indian partition in particular in the 20th century. Today's lecture is in some ways similar to the previous two lectures, which were on the trajectories of the Indian Republic and national Indian national movement today. The similarity in the three lectures is that in both the lectures that I have already delivered, I talked about the specific Indian experience of independence period of setting up an independent polity and the Indian national movement. I talked about the specific Indian experience against the generic global background. So I was able to, in a way, connect the two and also separate the two, the Indian and the global. Indian makes sense if it is put against a global backdrop, but Indian has its own specificities which need to be kept in mind. This distinction is equally important, and I will be following the same pattern today. I will talk about the Indian and the global. Uh, I think, if anything, the distinctions are going to be sharper today than they were in the previous two lectures. So the distinction will be between, let us say, the Indian partition with a capital P, and the multiple partitions that have happened in the 20th century, which the world has experienced. How do we put them together? And can all the partitions different types of partitions, different kinds of partitions. Is there a general framework? Are we in a position to put them? Are we in a position to put these multiple partitions as part of some general global framework, or is each one unique and specific? So that is the problematic. That is what I am going to explore and think about and talk about. Um, there has been a new salience to the question of the partition in the 21st century. That is my contention, that there is a new the whole question of partition has acquired a new salience in the 21st century, both at a political level, that is to say, at the level of lived realities, human experiences, and also at the level of articulations, theorizations. So, both in the manner in which reality has proceeded and in the manner in which social scientists have tried to make sense of that reality, in both of them, we can see a new salience being given to the question of partition. Why is that so? Why should there be this new thrust, new stress on partition and the idea of partition in the 21st century? It could possibly, one explanation could be that that the identity question has come up in a very big way in the last through 2 or 3 decades, not just in India but globally. It's just become, the identity question has become very important part of human life, human experiences. It has reached out to people's minds and hearts. There is a book by Francis Fukuyama. He's known much more by his other book, The End of History, but there is an equally important book by him by the same title, Identities, in which identity, in which he goes into this question of why identity question has become so important, and he goes into, gives his own reasons for it. So that could be one reason, because the question of partition is very directly related with the question of identities. There is possibly another explanation. It could also be because of the increasing pace of economic development in the last 3 decades. Now, what happens with economic development, when the pace of economic development increases, what it does is that it inevitably creates more disparities. Uh, and so the feeling of subjective perception, both of deprivation or discrimination, whether it whether it is a reality, whether it happens objectively or not, is one thing, but there is certainly an heightening in the subjective perception of both deprivation and discrimination. Now, that can easily feed into identity politics, which can then create cravings for the partition. It could also be at a larger level. It could also be related to the nature of modern industrial economy, which is very mobile. It creates conditions for mobility. And since the 16th century, at least, uh, modern industrial economy has turned the world into what we may call a patchwork of ethnicities. The world was no longer the old stable world since the 16th century, and it was constantly being transformed into a patchwork of ethnicities, different ethnic groups found in different places. Now, when that happens, and in an era of empowerment, now these different patchworks or different ethnicities, different ethnic groups, they begin to express themselves, they begin to articulate themselves, they begin to make demands for that particular group, for that particular category. And in the ultimate analysis, that demand can also take the form of wanting their own state. So there is something about the trajectory of modern industrial development which turns the world, which transforms the world into a patchwork of ethnicities, which lends a certain sharpness or certain salience to the question of nationality, nationalist question, but it also creates a craving for the partitions. So 21st century may be the highest stage of this phenomenon. These are, I'm just speculating, these are some of the reasons why I feel that the question of partition, the idea of partition, has acquired a new kind of salience in the 21st century. Talking particularly of India, I think it was on the 50th anniversary of Indian independence, so in the year 1997, that a new idea gained a lot of credibility. The new idea was that it's not independence. In 1997, we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of India's independence. But the new idea that gained credibility or that came up was that it's not so much independence, but it's partition. which is the defining theme or defining moment of 1947. So the idea that 1857, that 1997 needs to be remembered, should be remembered, not so much for the independence, um, but for the partition, because it was also the 50th anniversary of the partition of India. Subsequently, there has been, I think there was a silence on independence. I'm not saying that the silence was because of this new idea, but generally, there were not so many works which were being produced on India's independence or on the process that led to India's independence. In other words, Indian national movement, lot less, much less was being written on both the independence or on the national movement. This silence on Indian national movement is particularly remarkable if you compare with the kind and the amount and the degrees of writings on the French Revolution, for instance, and the Russian Revolution, in which in French Revolution for the last 2 centuries and Russian Revolution for the last 1 century, there has never been a dearth. All the time, new works, new perspectives, new ways of looking at them are coming up. Sociologies, of the participants, of leadership, etc. Nobody has ever said that the theme has exhausted itself and we don't need to write anymore on the French Revolution or on the Russian Revolution. But on Indian national movement, there was a sense that I think enough has been done. We need to move on. We need to do other things. So there was a kind of a silence. A social science, silence of the social scientists on independence and the process that had led to it. But there was a great burgeoning of works on the partition. It seemed that uh, all the scholarly energies were now being completely diverted to the theme of partition rather than independence. In general, globally speaking, zooming out of India, in today's lecture, I'll be focusing on India, but also be zooming out of India in a somewhat random manner. So my talk is not neatly divided between India and the globe. The two proceed simultaneously. In general, the 20th century may be considered, may be identified as a century of partitions. You know, historians like to divide phases into ages. I have in mind Hobsbawm's famous age of revolution, age of empire, age of capital. I think 20th century may be considered, may be designated the age of partitions. Too many partitions are happening. Uh, Different kinds of partitions, but too many of them. Let me just list some of them for you. There is, of course, India, Ireland, Palestine. I'm putting all these three together because, in many ways, they were very similar. These partitions happened on the basis of religion. They happened in an area which was under British control, either a British colony or a British mandate. Um, and these partitions happened in a situation of retreating imperialism. Whether it was in Ireland in 1921-22, whether it was in from Palestine around 47-48, or India in 1947. So all the partitions on the basis of religion, all the partitions in all these three in areas that were either British colonies or British mandate under British control, and in a situation of retreating imperialism. So they can all be put clubbed together. Cyprus, again, on the basis of religion. So this is one cluster of partitions which happens in the 20th century, or breakaway states from large empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Russian Empire. Particularly after the First World War, a large number of states are carved out after the dismantling of these empires, particularly the Ottoman and the Habsburg. That's the another cluster of partitions. Then there are areas which are partitioned but then reunited. Partitioned because of global rivalries, possibly, and then also reunited. And I have in mind Germany, and Vietnam. Then we have Yugoslavia, partitioned into three nation states. We have Czechoslovakia, extremely compatible, peaceful, golden, consensual, agreed upon kind of a partition, not much violence, not much bloodshed, not much contest, but a partition nonetheless. Then there is USSR, breakdown of the USSR into a large number of states. The Russian Empire did not was not dismantled, particularly after the end of the First World War. It survived under a new dispensation, a kind of socialist empire, but the dismantling happened 70 years later in the 1990s. And then there are breakaway states, Bangladesh from Pakistan, Kuwait from Iraq, and so on. So there is a enormously large number of partitions that are taking place under very different circumstances, but there is a certain cluster. They can be put into different clusters. There are too many partitions happening in the 20th century, for which reason one can call the 20th century a century of partitions. But much more than that, more than the fact of many partitions happening, it is also the idea of partition which acquires a great salience at many levels. So not just that many partitions are happening in the 20th century, but the idea of partition also uh, uh, acquiring a particular significance, different meanings, or mutations of the very idea of partition. There is, to begin with, a great perspectival divide between two broad positions. Partition as a fulfillment of legitimate national aspirations. If some groups can have a right to self determination, why not all? A partition is seen as something which satisfies the genuine nationalist urges and cravings of a group, of a people. Why should some be deprived of it? So there is a kind of, in this perspective, there is a genuineness to the partition. It's something positive, it's something important, it's something that provides a voice, identity to people. Or, I said there is a perspectival divide, or at the other end of the spectrum, or at the different spectrum altogether, it is seen as a mutation, vivisection, division, literally a partition of organic regions, organic zones, organic cultures. So partition in the second view is something which actually, it's a divider. It fragments societies, it divides, it's a great divider of human life. So it's something that provides identity to people, or it's something that actually divides people, it disrupts societies, it intervenes, and it acts as a disruptor, it dismantles things. So there is this great perspectival divide which also develops one and the other. The question of valid identities, genuine identities, versus the ones which are not genuine or artificial ones, this question becomes important. How to decide a valid identity from an artificial one? How far to go back in time? If time is an indicator, if time is a criterion, older identities, if an identity can be shown to have had a longer life, then it is somehow treated as legitimate and valid. And if the identity, a particular identity, does not have a long life, then it's probably created and contrived, it's artificial. But then how far back to go in time? What is the legitimate temporal dividing line? Can we draw a line in terms of time and say, if there are identities which have been predating this particular time, they are valid and legitimate, their aspirations should be recognized. But if there are identities which post date this, then we need to look upon them with some degree of suspicion. These are important questions to which there are no uh, correct or given answers, but these are important questions. In this perspectival divide between the two, between saying that it's a fulfillment of legitimate national aspirations, or is it mutation, vivisection, division, partition of composite zones. In between the two, there is a third dimension also. This comes from the British side through the practices of British imperialism. Since British were really implicated in so many partitions, as I talked about, Palestine, Israel, Palestine, Ireland, India, and Palestine. In this British practice, partition was seen, it was projected as a painful necessity, as a lesser evil. It was seen and recognized as bad, but the bad had to be resorted to in order to avoid and prevent the worse. So partition was bad, but if partition did not happen and was not done, it'll be worse. There'll be chaos, there'll be civil war, there'll be more violence, and so on. So partition was seen as a bad option to prevent a worse situation, which was the justification given by the British in every situation. It was also called an exit strategy. It was an exit strategy for the British. Uh, uh, one Penderel Moon wrote a book in the 1960s. He called it Divide and Quit. So dividing the area that was under British control was a part of quitting again. You know, leaving again, divide and quit again as a kind of exit strategy. So it's a very interesting perspectival divide at two extreme ends, but in between there is also this position which sees partition as bad but as a lesser evil, bad which is inevitable, which has to be done to prevent a greater disaster. Now in this perspectival contest, it's not just a perspectival divide, it's a perspectival contest on the question of partition. One idea gains great boost. And that idea is that there is something legitimate or fair about an ethnic group wanting its own separate, sovereign, representative state. It is somehow a part of a democratic right of a group. It is an urge which needs to be recognized. It's valid, it's legitimate. Why did this happen? Why did this idea, which prima facie there appears to be not much merit in it, why should an ethnic group can fight for recognition for other things, but why should an ethnic group necessarily have its own separate representative state? The idea at one level can be also can be spurious. So why does this idea gain so much of credibility in the 20th century? Why does this happen? Probably it happens because of the Jewish experiences in the 20th century, a great persecution of Jews wherever they were. Persecution obviously is a mild word, a genocidal experience of the Jews wherever they were. Great oppression, discrimination, and in extreme cases, violence of a genocidal nature. Maybe that this idea gained credibility because the only way all this could end was if Jews could somehow be united and given and get their own nation state. So the Jewish experience, the specific Jewish experience of the 20th century, may have been one factor. But also there are other factors that I can think of, as to why this idea of an ethnicity necessarily having its own nation state becomes so attractive, becomes so acceptable, becomes such a valid idea. I think in the 19th century, class and nation emerge as two big contenders for an internal division of the world. If world is one, but if there are going to be legitimate subunits within this world, what should those subunits be? And there are two big contenders which emerge in the 19th century, class and nation. Now, class may not have been a viable contender, may not have been a workable contender. How do you divide a world into classes? But at least there was clarity on what class meant. Nobody ever had any doubt about the exact meaning, definition of class. But it was not so with nations. Nations, there was a great ambiguity, and that ambiguity increased in the 20th century on what a nation is, which group can be called a nation, as against a non-nation, which human collectivity can be designated as nation and which human collectivity is not a nation. In the 20th century, there was a certain clubbing of two very different political experiences in the understanding definition of nation around the time of the First World War. First, of course, those countries, those societies, those groups, those people who were fighting for independence from imperialism, independence from European imperialism, societies and countries of Asia and Africa. And those they were fighting imperialism, struggling against imperialism, struggling for independence, but also being constituted into nations in the process. So that was one meaning that was given to a nation. The second meaning was given was those of breakaway units from large empires that had survived till the 20th century. Habsburg, Ottoman, Russian, but particularly Habsburg and Ottoman. Now, it is from this conspectus or from this matrix that the question of partition emerges. The catchword in partition is, of course, self-determination. Now, this becomes an extremely important word, which is basically a definitive. It begins to define the idea of partition. Now, interestingly, this idea of self-determination, it also got legitimacy from two European documents. One was prepared in the first during the course of the First World War, and second during the course of the Second World War. And they both brought up this idea of self-determination. During the First World War, of course, Wilsonian 14 points, Woodrow Wilson, US president, who proposed a kind of peace formula in 1918, in which he placed great stress on the principle of self-determination. Representative states, people being given a voice, and so on. And second, of course, was the Atlantic Charter of 1941 during the course of the Second World War, in which it was stated that territorial changes, territories of countries, of nation states, they cannot really be made. Territorial changes cannot be made against the wishes of the people. People ought to decide. But what do you do when people decide in all kinds of different ways? There is no guarantee, there is no formula that people will decide just one way, that there will be a consensus. You know the story, you know the great interesting irony about the Atlantic Charter was that whereas independence for countries was being projected, was being put forward, India was not included in it. And Churchill saw to it that India was not included. So India was still seen as a part of the British Empire, therefore not deserving of independence. Um, if you ask Churchill, if you looked at Churchill, he might have seen Indian independence as a partition of India from the British Empire. So there is always, on question of partition, there are always different vantage points which would look at partition in two very different ways, the two perspectives: a genuine fulfillment of nationalist aspirations, or actually a division, vivisection, partition. These two very different perspectives were at work in a large number of partition cases of the 20th century. The idea of self-determination bridged the differences, or it rather clubbed together very different kinds of political experiences. In times to come, so it became a catch-all word to under it, and it stood for a whole range of different political situations and experiences. In times to come, the idea of self-determination came to be employed in four different situations, at least, maybe more, but four at least. Let me briefly tell you. First, of course, was the 19th century idea in which a political roof was to be found for cultural units, groups that are culturally united, but without a state of their own. This was the case in erstwhile areas of Germany and Italy, areas where there was some kind of a cultural connectivity, commonality. In Germany since the days of Reformation, in Italy since the days of Renaissance, but no single state. And so the first meaning of self-determination was a political roof, a state for otherwise groups that are diverse but culturally together. The second meaning, of course, was, as I just said, breakaway units from empires, which was experienced at the end of the First World War. The third meaning of self determination was anti imperialist struggles by colonies of Asia and Africa fighting against imperialism, European domination. And fourth was, once these countries became independent, the ex colonies, when they became independent nation states, many groups, regions, or people or communities experienced a kind of disenchantment with the nation state, and particularly from 1960s onwards, and uh, wanted their own representative state. This could be because of the precariousness of economic development or the unevenness of economic development. And if the unevenness was experienced along the axis of region or culture or religion, then this could always feed into the demand for a separate nation state. So the word self-determination became operative in a whole range, very different kinds of situations. And they were all situations of self-determination. So there was a kind of an opening up of the idea of self-determination. Um, Once it opened up, then it could go to any length. If it was okay for some people or some groups or some societies to have the right of self-determination, why not all? If the self-determination, if self-determination is a kind of a birthright, then nobody should be denied. Why should it just be confined to Europe or some countries? It should be open to everybody, all communities, all people. This is this the idea of self-determination. If defined in this manner, it is also a recipe for both anarchy and disaster. It is broadly in this cluster of ideas and possibilities, and all of them belong to the 20th century, that the idea of partition, in a way, also becomes acceptable, also becomes legitimate, also begins to be seen as a kind of a solution to a problem. Let me put this cluster together to make it clear for you what all is happening in the 20th century, which somehow makes this idea of partition uh, acceptable or legitimate. One, a great decline in the Marxian paradigm, in which there was no place for ethnic considerations or ethnicities, or the ideas that ethnicities should have their own representative state. Marxism was almost ethnicity neutral. It did not place enough importance. Um, um, there is a famous statement by Lenin. I don't have the exact statement, where he said that he was committed, as far as Jewish life was concerned, he was committed to Jewish life, Jewish livelihood, etc., protection for Jewish people. But as far if it was a question of Jewish, their language and their culture, etc., he wasn't really bothered. Why should he go to protect their culture? If one culture replaces another, so let it be. Important thing is to ensure livelihood, life, protection, not so much as culture and language and so on. This was a kind of a flavor. This seems scandalous today, but this was a kind of this was very this was very central to Marxian paradigm, to be ethnicity neutral, to be not to not think of the ethnic question at all. This happened, but there was a decline in this tradition, in this intellectual tradition, in this paradigm. Secondly, there was a kind of a relativism, in which there always is a kind of flattening out of differences. What is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Nobody should be privileged. So if the idea of self-determination is there, it needs to be opened up to all. Everybody should happen. If it's a forbidden fruit, even if self-determination is a forbidden fruit, why should only some taste it? Why should only some have it? It should be let everybody taste it. Thirdly, there was a decline in the legitimacy of the established nation states. The nation states, new nation states that were established, particularly after the Second World War, there was a decline in their legitimacy, or their legitimacy began to be questioned. And therefore, that created an opening for breakaway nations. Um, if there is nothing sacred about national boundaries, national borders. If national borders are really constructed ones, then they can be reconstructed. If they were constructed once, they can be reconstructed again. Now, that obviously creates opening this perspective for partitions. Fourthly, a very egg and a chicken kind of a situation, kind of a relationship between ethnic violence and partition, between ethnic violence and a craving for partition. Violence creates a justification for partition, and the partition creates more violence, and then the two, they constantly feed into each other, they constantly reproduce each other. So any situation of ethnic violence, which 20th century was, would obviously create an opening, will give a boost to the question of partition. So I think the idea of partition um, became acceptable, in some cases even attractive, for this whole range of reasons that I have just listed. Plus, of course, the instability created by rapid economic growth. All this means that although the 21st century has not experienced many partitions, but the idea of partition has become much more acceptable. There is no longer a stigma attached to it that there was. Let me now briefly, in another 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, let me now briefly look at India. How does India represent? Does India represent a departure from what I have just described? How does India represent a departure from this generic picture? And is there a sense in which India can be put into this conspectus or this matrix? Well, certain things stand out. Certain facts about India's partition really stand out, and they actually set it apart from many other partitions. Consider the following: violence. India's partition was much more bloody, much more violent than any other partitions. We don't know, but something like 300,000, 3 lakhs to about 2 million people died in partition violence. The profile of killer was not that of trained professional violent, brutal killers. They could be people like you and I. Many people killed in order to save their own lives. Such was the situation. Such was the extent of suspicion and hatred along religious lines. So, an enormously large number of people were killed during partition violence. About 70,000 women were abducted and raped, and that's now a lot of research has been done, and that's a very brutal story, which makes India's partition somewhat different and unique, and sets it apart from the whole range of whole other partition, all other, various other partitions that happened in the 20th century. About 12 to 15 million people migrated from one part to the other. So this is probably, certainly, the greatest uh, human migration around a single event. Blacks, there was migration between the 16th and the 18th century from Africa to Americas, Latin Americas, but there were about 13 million, but that happened over a that was stretched over almost two centuries. This partition around a single event in a remarkably short period of time, something like 12 to 15 million people, they migrate. And this migration is not engendered by opportunities. It's not opportunity driven. It is driven by a desire to survive. It's survival driven. Quite often, people were not searching for a better life. They actually left a better life behind. They left a better life behind and opted for a life of penury, just to save their lives, only to survive. So these 15 million people, a large number of them, 12 to 15 million people, they migrated, but it was a forced migration. They were forced to migrate, forced by the circumstances or forced by the desire to survive, to save one's life. Um, Violence and migration, forced migration, happened in other cases also, but not to such an extent as the Indian case. So that sets apart Indian partition from all the other partitions that I just described to you. Also, uh, it did not solve any problem and, in fact, created many more problems. So it couldn't really be considered to be even an attempted solution to a problem. It made the problem much worse. uh, India's proposed partition, was projected as a solution to the minority problem. There was a minority problem, minorities were being persecuted here, etc., etc. There was discrimination against the minorities, and therefore partition. But partition actually made the minority problem much worse. The minority problem was exacerbated in India and in Pakistan. Both societies had their share of minorities, and later Bangladesh. And in all the cases, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, these were persecuted minorities, probably much more persecuted and discriminated against than was the case before 1947. India and Pakistan did not really live like happy neighbors, as was being projected. Jinnah, the leader of the partition movement, he used to say that once partition happens, India and Pakistan will live like good friends. Pakistan will it will protect India's frontiers, because it is through that zone that invasions have happened on India. But Pakistan will be a kind of a buffer state. It will protect India, and India and Pakistan will live like happy neighbors. That obviously did not happen. India and Pakistan have gone to war with each other 4 times, which probably is the maximum number of wars two countries have gone. Two countries have gone against each other since the Second World War. Um, Even Pakistan could not remain united. Pakistan went through yet another partition in 1971, thereby reinforcing this spiral, this nature of the very nature of partition, that it creates conditions for violence and therefore more partitions. Kashmir problem is again a legacy of the partition, legacy of what happened in 1947. It's not a problem. It's not a carryover from the 18th or century or whatever. It is very much a modern thing. So quite clearly, by no stretch of imagination, can it be said that India's partition um, even remotely solved any problem. Um, so that is something which sets India's partition apart from various other partitions that happened in the 20th century. There is one sense, of course, there is one sense, however, in which there is some resemblance of the Indian partition with the generic pattern. And it is that there are still from different vantage points, the partition appears very, very different. The event of partition, the phenomenon of partition, it appears very different. And let me just give you a story. It's anecdotal, not being written about anywhere, but it's probably a true story. B.R. Nanda, one of our greatest of historians, he narrated this story. Uh, After partition happened, there was a kind of a silence on this amongst the historians and social scientists. We know that not very much was written in the late 40s and 50s. And then it was in 1965 that a big conference was organized, not in India, not in Pakistan, but in London, on the partition. The importance of this conference was that they invited scholars, social scientists from the two countries, but also bureaucrats from the three countries, England, but also participants in the partition movement or in the movement against the partition. So a large number of people were invited. B.R. Nanda was one of the historians who went from the part of the Indian contingent, along with S.R. Mehrotra, Muhammad Mujib. From the Pakistan side, there was Z.H. Zaidi, Khalid bin Saeed, I.H. Qureshi. Now, there, B.R. Nanda noticed a very interesting phenomenon. Um, the vantage point and the questions were very different among the Indian historians, Indian contingent and the Pakistani contingent. For Indian contingent, for people like Muhammad Mujib and Mehrotra and S.R. Mehrotra and B.R. Nanda, the very important question behind their inquiry was, why did partition have to happen? Could it not have been avoided? Was it inevitable? If it wasn't, at which state did it become inevitable? The question is, could it have been avoided at any point in time? Now, this perspective came in for a lot of questioning by the Pakistani contingent. And they questioned the very validity of this question. If the question is not legitimate, then you can't get a good answer. And they said, why is this question being raised? It's not, why should it be raised whether partition could have been avoided or not? Are Indians asking a question, could Indian independence have been avoided or not? They said that Pakistan is their tryst with destiny. It is just like independence was Indians' tryst with destiny. Making of Pakistan was their tryst with destiny. It was their moment of arrival. It was a result of their national movement. So there was one national movement which culminated in India's independence, and there was another national movement which culminated in Pakistan. And they questioned the Indian contingent for raising this question. Why that could partition have been avoided? Why ask this question? It's not a fair question. Indian contingent may not have provided the answer, may not have been in a position to provide the answer, but the answer was provided by history. Answer was provided a few years later when Pakistan was partitioned, a new nation state, Bangladesh was made, and this time again their questions were different. The Pakistani contingent would have raised the question, was it inevitable? Could it have been avoided? Could Pakistani establishment have behave differently so as to avoid the partition of Pakistan? But that's not how the Bangladeshis would look upon it. They would not ask this question, could the making of Bangladesh have been avoided? For them, it was their tryst with destiny. It was a culmination of their struggle, their just and genuine struggle. So one person's struggle, one person's genuine nationalist struggle is another person's partition. So two very different, from different vantage points, the entire cluster can look very differently, can be defined and identified and designated very, very differently. That is one sense in which India's partition fits into the generic story. But in many other respects, um, there are commonalities with the global pattern. I think, uh, I think that the Indian partition or the India's experience of partition should, or the India's partition in 1947 should make us all very cautious while mechanically accepting the thesis of partition. We should be we should apply, it should make us cautious, we should apply some caution while accepting this thesis, or the notion that the uh, creation of either that this creation, that the partition, creation of new nation states out from the older ones is either natural or legitimate. The creation of new nation states from the older ones. The creation of new nation states from the older ones, we need to suspect, we need to be cautious whether it can be considered either marvelous or liberating. Is it necessarily a liberating idea? Is there something marvelous about the creation of new nation states from the older ones? Is it a liberating experience? We need to question this. We need to raise more questions about it. Let me just end by a kind of a hypothetical demonstration, but a kind of hypothetical story, which I generally in my classrooms, I tell the story to my students and I open it to them and then I ask them questions. But that gives us a entry point, that gives us a vantage point from where to acquire a credible perspective on the question of partition without simplifying its complexity. Let us say, as of now, the world is divided into 200 nation states, 200 nation states which are recognized as legitimate, valid by an international body. So there is a recognition of about 200 nation states. Now, out of these 200 nation states, from within these 200 nation states, there are about 2,000 nationalist claims doing the rounds. Within these societies, there are regions, there are communities, there are groups that are disenchanted, not their they feel that their legitimate demands, their aspirations are not being met, and that their legitimate aspirations can only be met, their their nationalist cravings can only be satisfied if they have their own separate representative sovereign nation states. So there are about 2,000 such nationalist claims doing the rounds. They want their own territory, but there is actually no territory available outside these 200 nation states. So, to satisfy the nationalist urges of these groups and communities and people and regions, these older nation states have to be, their boundary lines, their territories have to be compromised with. There have to be partition, in other words. How to do it? Let us say the UN invites applications from these 2,000 people. They should apply for a status of a separate nation state, a separate territory on which they would have their own state. They should provide the justification, the rationale, the justification. Maybe there is discrimination, maybe there is not enough safety for them, or a whole range of justifications. They should provide justifications, which would then be examined by a committee of wise people. So there is a select committee of mature, wise people who does the shortlisting, and which then looks at all these 2,000 cases and finds that out of those 2,000 cases, about 1,000 cases do not merit attention. They're not genuine. They don't need their claims are not real. Their claims are fake or overstated or contrived. But there are about 800 to 1,000 cases which are genuine, and therefore there is some merit in recognizing their cravings, their aspirations for a separate nation state of them. And therefore, to meet their claims, to satisfy their claims, the existing boundaries have to be suitably drawn, boundaries of the existing nation states. And so, in the new scenario, there will be about 1,200, if we accept 1,000 as genuine cases, there will be about 1,200 nation states in place of the earlier 200 nation states. So same earth, same territory, same zone, same land of the earth is now divided into 1,200 nation states, which is probably a more fair arrangement because it satisfies the nationalist principle, nationalist urges of, or in other words, it satisfies the self-determination of large number of groups. It is able to accommodate the urge of for self-determination of a large number of groups. Now, between these two worlds, this is what I used to ask my students. One world which is divided between 200 nation states, but large number of groups who feel that their aspirations are not being met, and a world which is divided between 1,200 nation states. Out of these two worlds, which would be a better world in terms of more violence, less violence, in terms of stability, in terms of people's demand being met, in terms of uh, various cravings being satisfied? Which of the two would be a better scenario? The one of 200 nation states erstwhile, or the one of 1,200 nation states? And invariably, large number of my students said that yes, in the second situation, in a situation of 1,200 nation states, all the other problems, all the older problems of the 200 nation states will still be there. And in addition, there will be many more because the rivalries will increase. Rivalries within the areas will, of course, remain, but across nation states will also increase. So that should perhaps make us suspect or make us question uh, the naturalness of this idea of self determination, the naturalness of this idea of nationalist cravings or nationalist aspirations, or a group wanting its own nation state. We should not simplify a complex reality of partitions. There have been violences, discriminations, genocides in the past, and there have been situations in the 20th century when we felt that making a separate nations, there is no alternative to it, of this. And of course, large number of old colonies, they benefited by this principle of self-determination. It actually satisfied the nationalist cravings. So it's a complex question, but at least from the Indian experience, from many other experiences, and from my hypothetical story about 200 versus 1200, we should at least be in a position to question. Let's not question in an a priori manner the legitimacy of the idea of self determination, but let us at least be in a position to question the naturalness of the idea, the naturalness and an a priori legitimacy of this idea. And there is nothing of that kind. And this idea of self determination is also fraught with all kinds of dangers. And therefore, the world in which the world in which the urge for partition is very strong, very dominant because of identity question or many other questions. That world is not an unsafe world. Not its world is not a safe world. It is an unsafe world. So it is a huge problem to think about. And I think one way of thinking about it is to question the very naturalness of this idea of self-determination. But thank you very much. I'll stop now. I've left out many things, but maybe some of them will be taken up at the time of questions. Thank you. Over to you, Chandni.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Misra, for this lecture. Uh, like we were discussing before, partition is close to many of us, especially in the northern India, since our families have seen it. And your lecture gave us a more practical way, a more historic and a researched or nuanced way of looking at it. So thank you very much. I especially enjoyed and greatly was enlightened by your inevitability versus twist with destiny argument, because this is a question that comes to all of us, irrespective of at what age we are. That was partition inevitable, or had to have, matlab, was there a way out of it? So thank you very much for giving us that way to look at it. Dear audience, we have about 6-7 minutes for Q&A. So I'll use the chair's privilege and ask a few questions because I have lots, but I'll ask a few, and then we'll go to the Q&A in the YouTube live chat. So please keep typing your questions there. We are reading those as we speak. My question is inevitably related to the last point that you talked about 1,200 nation states versus 200 nation states. And sir, one often, as a master's student, we hear this, that nation is a European concept, that the word nation comes from maybe the unity, the nationalization that Germany saw or Italy saw, or that in India, or especially let's talk about Punjab. I'm from Punjab. That the idea of Watan is more prominent here. Punjab Watan, yeah, Gujarat ka Watan, yeah, Bengal, Sindh, Maharashtra. So if you could give your insight on that, that nation is Watan, or are they synonymous?
You see, in the 19th century, in different languages, there are a lot of many words that are used for these human collectivities. So you talked about Watan, Qaum is another one. Rashtra is even an older term from older later Vedic times. In England, country was another term. Now, if you asked someone from the 17th century what country meant, he would say either the village or a municipality or a smaller unit at smaller. So that's country. But the power of nationalism is that it begins to appropriate all these terms. So in the 19th century, in India, in Europe, but also in India, a lot of these terms begin to be employed for nation. So the power, the conceptual power of nation is such that it appropriates multiple other expressions that had, and it gives them a new meaning. So in the 20th century, Vatan, Qaum, Rashtra, country, folk, all of these words, which are older terms with older meanings, but all of them begin to be employed for this new phenomenon called the nation. Well, that always happens when a new powerful thing, a concept comes, a phenomenon comes for which we find a concept, then multiple other ones begin to be roped in. This is true. This is true for the word like people. People is just an ordinary term for a collectivity, but at some point, for a progressive language, people comes to mean one thing. So that happens. Uh, all these terms, Vatan, folk, Rashtra, Qaum, Millat, not so much Millat, but Qaum, they begin to be used for nation in the 19th and the 20th centuries.
But sir, how long does it take for the meaning to change? For example, Batan is like Punjab, from becoming Punjab to becoming India as we know it today. That geography and that multicultural sort of a landmass. How quickly? How it's is it fascinating? Isn't it fascinating how it's changed dramatically over a century? Or is the nationalism fervor so strong that the idea has changed overnight? Because usually ideas can take longer.
The nationalist fervor is so strong that the different words begin to be used in the light of nationalism. There is no fixed formula about how long it takes. In our times, it takes much less time because there's been a compression of time. But in a remarkably short period of time, concepts can acquire new meanings and they can lose older meanings. Words can lose older meanings and they can all acquire new meanings. It can happen in a very remarkably short period of time.
Sir, I understand that we're running out of time, so I'll quickly go to the audience questions because I have a lot of questions.
Sure, sure.
Sir, Haider Khan has asked about your view on the idea of more breakaway nations based on cultural, socio-economic needs. Do you agree with this idea or not?
No, I do not. As I said, I think the notion that cultures can be satisfied only when they have their own political roof, their own nation state, or language groups can fulfill themselves only when there is their own nation state. I think I am very suspicious of this idea. And break away of large countries, large units into smaller units does not always solve a problem. In fact, it can create more problem. So in an a priori manner, I'm suspicious of this idea that cultural groups or linguistic groups or small regions must necessarily, in order for them to express themselves, they must have their own separate nation state. I'm not very comfortable with this idea and I'm suspicious of the validity of this idea.
Thank you, sir. Sir, Vidya Khader asks, how does the idea of the European Union stand to a nation state like India? There are common factors like religion, cultural interactions, and differences in terms of languages, religion, etc.
India actually stands at a crossroad, and when there are two different models available open. One is the European model. What is the European Union model? What is European Union model? That for economic purposes, for purpose of trade, for purposes of transactions, for purposes of model, you create a common zone. But for purposes of culture and language and other things, they remain separate. So the success of European Union is that they are culturally they are all separate. Each national culture protects itself, but for economic and other purposes they come together. Common currency, that's a big thing. That's one model. The other model is USSR, in which uh, an attempt to create unity and homogeneity actually ends up in disruption. Not disruption, ends up being dismantled in the dismantling of the empire. Now India is as plural as USSR was, linguistically and culturally, probably more, and also Indian European was. So India stands at a midpoint. Uh, it can go one way or it can go the other way. We hope that India should go the European Union way, in which all other connectivities are forced for economic purposes, for trading purposes, for various other transactions. But cultural autonomy, linguistic expressions, literature, etc., they must find their full expression. That's the best model. I mean, I hope that would work for India. But as of now, India stands at a midpoint between the European Union model and the USSR model.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we are at the top of the hour and we had reserved only an hour of your time. Would it be possible to take a few more questions before we
Yes,
end?
yes, 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 yes.
Thank you, sir.
If there are.
Yes, sir, we do have a
Yeah,
few.
sure, sure. Yeah, sure.
So there's a question from the YouTube live chat which says, within the largest setup of the nation state, these other ideas of human collections, Vatan, Com, so on, get stamped down. Wouldn't the existence of such structures challenge the authority of the state? The blank comedy show has asked this question on YouTube.
I'm not sure if I've understood this question, but let me still try. You see, nations can be new nation states. They all resemble each other, but each nation state is unique. So there can be nation states that are organized around federal principles, around plural principle. There can be nation states which are not so centralized, in which the multiple units within find fuller expression, but these multiple units within, they, because they find fuller expression, therefore they do not challenge the centralized nation state. That's the best model. But sometimes, in order to achieve unity, nation states tend to be, or the leaders of the nation states tend to be somewhat contemptuous of plurality, multiple pluralities of culture and religion and language and so on. So they try and flatten out or homogenize. Now, in some cases, this can work, but this can also be counterproductive, because when cultures are threatened with extinction, then people also become very edgy, very sensitive, and then they want to create boundaries around their culture or their language and so on. I think the best principle still is a kind of a federal plural principle, in which political centralization, political and economic centralization is accompanied by cultural and linguistic autonomy. That is the best combination, in which cultures feel safe, they feel autonomous, they have the freedom for their own expression, languages, literatures, and yet politically and economically, there is a kind of a centralization. So, total centralization is chaotic, total centralization is oppressive, but total decentralization is chaotic. Between that, the better model is political economic centralization, cultural, linguistic, religious autonomy.
Thank you, sir. So my next question is about the about more to do with your expertise on communalism. And the one thing that one often hears, especially from oral history accounts, is that nobody saw the partition coming. In context of the communal tension that ran so high, with people saying, "Oh, we did not see it coming." How true is this statement, or is it have memories romanticize the past because that's what we tend to do? What is it that is?
No, I think it is true that people did not see it coming. You see, the big violence. See, India was, through the 20th century, or let's say from some part of the 19th century, India had witnessed little bit of communal violence, prejudices between Hindus and Muslims, particularly, they were there. Prejudices are not exclusive of harmony. It's possible for groups to work in harmony and yet maintain cultural and other kinds of prejudices against each other. So that history is older, in the sense that not very much older, but certainly since the 19th century. There are cases of communal violence in the 20th century, but that really big violence happens from August 1946. It's big because it happens as a chain reaction. It starts from Calcutta, goes to Noakhali, goes to Bengal, Bihar, goes to Bombay, goes to UP. For the first time, India experiences this, what we called a chain, connected chain of communal violence, in which you have violence in one area and then it moves to other areas, and the whole area is within the flames of communal violence. This had not happened before 1947. But the fact that there is violence would not suddenly create conditions for partition. So I can perfectly see that people felt that this was not, that some way will be found. Till 1945, 46, through cabinet mission proposal, through interim government, there was this notion that some way will be found and that would and that partition would be prevented. So I think this notion was there, and I think this notion was there. People didn't see it coming, in the sense that they felt that some way will certainly be found. I think it was it. I don't think it's just a romantic idea, or it's a nostalgia that has been conjured up in subsequent times. I think definitely people in Punjab and Bengal did not see it coming. Punjab and Bengal were composite regions. So it would have been difficult to imagine that certainly a line will be drawn and they will be part of different nation states. So I am willing to believe that people did not see it coming.
Uh, Thank you, sir. So my last question is with regards to the fact that many people post freedom movement and partition many people went on to live in the UK. So my concluding question would be that nationalism, with its totally anti-colonial, anti-European propaganda, and with people ironically going to the UK to settle after aftermath, was nationalism not that strong as it was touted to be by the leaders, or was this just a minority reaction on the part of some people?
No, nationalism has been very strong in the 20th century, but even strongest of nationalisms do not come in the way of migrations of this point time. These migrations are driven by opportunity. So if someone migrates from India to America, he or she is migrating for better opportunities. Now, they don't see this as a violation of the spirit of nationalism, and it is actually not. When they go to Europe and America, sometimes you would notice that culturally they are more Indian than many people who are within India, because they find themselves under alien conditions, so they retrieve or reconstruct what they call a national culture, ways of language, dressing, etc. So I don't think nationalism is threatened by migrations. Nationalism cannot completely stop migrations, and there are human urges, there are opportunities, desire for a better life, which makes people travel to far away lands. This craving has been there in history even before modern times. I don't think it weakens nationalism, but nationalism is never strong enough to suppress or stop these urges for a better life, for better opportunities, etc. So I think the two exist with each other. Nationalism and migrations of this kind, they coexist with each other in a very harmonious model.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Mishra. I realize it's 10:10. We've already gone
Yes.
10 minutes above time, so we won't be keeping you any longer. First of all, sir, thank you very much for agreeing to do this three-part lecture series. We hope, and please consider this as an invitation that whenever you get the time, we would love to have you back for another lecture series here at Car Heritage. Because
I would love to. Yes.
thank you. Because voices like yours have become extremely important in making sense of our past as it's getting older, especially the recent past, as in the modern history, quote unquote, the national history. So thank you very much, sir, for giving us your time and for answering all our questions. And thank you once again for accepting our invitation and for your scholarship and for your time. Thank you, audience, for your questions. And should you have any further questions, leave those in the comment section, and we would email those to sir and then get back to you. So leave those here and we will reply here itself. So thank you very much again, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Thank you very much, sir, for your time.
Thank you, Chandni. Thank you so much.